and I'm still getting frame drop. No one else in my house has 5 gig. Like my TV, even when I'm streaming, it chops. Like everything else is 2 gig. But yeah, man, Slixios, if you're watching, like, if you could make a tutorial video, seriously, for the community, like, on how to set that shit up, all your equipment, how to do it, like, for people, like, who are less tech savvy than myself, even, I know the community would appreciate that. And I speak for a lot of people when I say that. Because, yeah, I think Quest 2 is the way to go now. I really, really do.
All right, this video is for Pink Ponage and anybody else in the VR community that's looking to get the most out of their Quest 2 and set up an optimal AirLink or virtual desktop wireless VR experience. So, getting right into it, I think we're going to start with explaining the difference between AirLink and virtual desktop, kind of the pros and cons and how they work. So you guys have a fundamental understanding of how these technologies work so that you can better set these technologies up for yourself. So this is a document from MetaQuest or from Meta's website detailing exactly how Oculus Link works and also how AirLink works, because the technology behind Oculus Link is also the technology between AirLink. Basically, the only difference is Oculus Link works over a USB cable and AirLink works over your network. So the technology for Oculus Link is pretty complicated, very sophisticated software. Oculus is doing a lot of tricks to minimize latency in the background. Lots of different stuff happening here with the Oculus Link software and the compositing they're doing. But basically, the gist is this, and it's explained in this diagram here. So you have the PC here and the Quest here. So everything starts at the PC app or the game. For most people watching this, the game's going to be Population 1. So the game spits out a frame which comes over into the PC runtime and the compositor. And the compositor is going to take that frame, it's going to split it up into the eye textures and do all the various layer compositions. Are calling it the warp, but it's going to make those frames look correct for the Oculus Quest, and it's going to send them over to the Oculus Quest, and it's going to do that by encoding each frame. Encoding is what allows them to send this video over USB or over the network. Encoding takes those frames and then they compress them into a smaller package that can then be sent over USB or over your network. Those frames are then decoded on the Oculus Quest, and they are displayed on the screen on your Quest, and you actually see the frame. The important part of AirLink is this is the poses input state part. So this is your position of your headset and the position of your controllers getting sent back to your PC, because not only do we have to send the frames from the game to the PC, but then we have to tell the PC where your controllers are, where your headset is, what controls you are sending, or what your controls you're hitting, so that the game can react accordingly. So the important part about Oculus Link and AirLink is that they don't just send those commands back to the game. They actually cut the game out of the equation and send those poses and input straight to the compositor. Reason being, the game already has some frames coming out of the game. So with this whole big process here, there's a lot of latency, and if you had to wait for a frame to come out of the game through the compositor over here, and then then you're able to react to it because you see it on your screen, and then your reaction has to go into the game and then come out of the game. They have figured out how to reduce the latency by skipping the game entirely and sending your poses and input states straight to the compositor. And the compositor will take the frames coming out of the game, and it will actually modify them and edit them in real time so that they can be more quickly sent back to back to the Oculus. And then it also updates the game so the game doesn't get too out of sync with things. But so it's actually taking frames that have already come out of the game, and it's editing them to get them over the Quest even faster than they otherwise would be. So this results in reduced latency over AirLink. This is something that Virtual Desktop doesn't do. However, Virtual Desktop has its own advantage, and that is visual quality. So Virtual Desktop doesn't do all those neat compositor tricks to reduce latency, but they do use a more recent, more modern encoder or more modern video codec. So while AirLink and Oculus Link are limited to H.264 or AVC, Virtual Desktop uses H.265 or HEVC, which is a more modern encoder. It uses newer, more advanced mathematical tricks, and in general, just results in a higher picture quality with less notable compression artifacts. So if you've ever used AirLink, you've probably noticed things get kind of blocky or blurry at times. Where if you've ever played Virtual Desktop or if you've ever compared AirLink to Virtual Desktop, you've probably noticed that Virtual Desktop is a lot clearer and a lot sharper, a lot cleaner image, and that's because of the newer codec they're using to compress the frames. They're still compressing the frames like AirLink, but they're just using a newer technology to do it, which results in higher quality. So in general, if you're playing a competitive VR game where latency and reaction times are going to be really important, I do recommend AirLink. So for Population 1 specifically, I highly, highly recommend anybody who wants to be competitive in Population 1 to be using AirLink. But if you're using, more laid-back game, a slower game, a game with better graphics fidelity, something that's not so latency dependent, I do recommend Virtual Desktop for the better quality that it provides. So yeah, that's a little breakdown there of AirLink versus Virtual Desktop and the different situations where you might want to use one or the other. As far as setting up an optimized performant AirLink or Virtual Desktop setup, well, for AirLink specifically, and this won't work for Virtual Desktop, but it will work for AirLink. If you're not that tech savvy, you don't really want to do a ton of work to get things working, and you just want a simple solution because you're tired of connecting your computer through a cable. Meta does provide this D-Link VR AirBridge, or rather D-Link provides this for Meta. And what this is a little Wi-Fi dongle that plugs directly into your computer, and it basically bypasses your home network and creates a direct Wi-Fi link between your computer and your headset. Now, I have bought one of these and I have tested them out, and it does work fairly well. It's not perfect, but it does work pretty well. But it does not work as good as AirLink or Virtual Desktop work over my optimized home network. So again, if you want a simple solution to get wireless VR working, the D-Link VR AirBridge is a good solution. But if you want the best wireless VR experience for your Quest 2, or your Meta Quest Pro, or Quest 3 in the future, please continue watching. Okay, so this is a picture of the Virtual Desktop performance overlay, and I have this here because I want to basically go through where latency occurs within the wireless VR setup. And Virtual Desktop provides this really nice performance overlay that enumerates all these various values. AirLink, to my knowledge, does not provide any sort of resource like this. So troubleshooting AirLink is a lot more difficult than Virtual Desktop. So for all of you out there, I actually recommend, if you can, to pick up a copy of Virtual Desktop, if only to help you troubleshoot AirLink for this specific tool. Basically any issue that you're experiencing with Virtual Desktop is also going to be an issue you're having with AirLink. They work differently in that Virtual Desktop doesn't do all those funny compositor tricks, but at the end of the day, there's still a technology that is encoding and sending frames from your computer to your headset, and they're subject to all the same issues. So looking at this performance overlay, frame rate's fairly obvious. This is the frame rate that this person has set for their VR. We want higher frame rate than that, but that's okay. This latency number here, this is the total latency it takes for a frame to go from your computer to your headset. So we want that number to be as low as possible. Bitrate has to do with encoding. So as you can see here below, codec is HEVC. So that's what I was talking about earlier, that newer codec that provides better quality for Virtual Desktop. The bitrate is basically how much data per second the encoder is allowed to use to compress the frame. So a lower bitrate means that your you're reducing the amount of data that the encoder is allowed to use to compress those images. So as a result, because there's less total data allotted to the encoder, the frames that come out are going to be lower quality, and also the encoder is going to have to work harder because it's going to have to do extra mathematical tricks to compress those frames to fit that lower bit rate that you're demanding. So in general, we want to set our bit rate fairly high. 65 megabits per second is a pretty good bit rate. Now, we don't want to set our bit rate too high because then we run into other issues. For example, for AirLink specifically, I've seen that if the bit rate is set much higher than 100 megabits per second, we run into compositor issues where all that fancy software that's happening in the background actually gets bogged down because there's so much extra data when you set the bit rate too high. That compositor and all that fancy frame chopping that's going on to reduce latency gets all bogged down and it starts screwing up. Also, if we set the bit rate too high, we could overload the decoder because on the other end, once we've encoded the frames, they have to get decoded by the headset, and a larger bit rate, greater bit rate means the decoder has to work harder, decoding more data. So in general, we want to find a sweet spot between, really the lowest bit rate for the highest quality. So I would reduce your bit rate until you start noticing reductions in quality. And once you start to notice the reduction in quality, set it back to where it was where you weren't noticing any reduction in quality and leave your bit rate there because you want the lowest bit rate without sacrificing quality. Now going over these latency numbers. So this 45 milliseconds is the total latency, but Virtual Desktop actually breaks this 45 milliseconds down into 4 sub numbers: game, encoding, network, and decoding. So the game latency is how long it takes the game to render each individual frame. Pretty simple stuff. If your game latency is too high, so just so you guys know, in this instance, there are no issues. At 45 milliseconds, this person is able to run Virtual Desktop at 72 frames per second with no issue. But if these latency numbers were to get too high, they would turn yellow. So this latency number would become yellow if it became too high, and the individual latencies that are causing the issue would become yellow. So if there was a big problem in the network latency would be too high and it would be yellow. So in this case, they're all white because all the numbers are in check. But yeah, so if your game latency were to turn yellow or be too high, what you would need to do is either reduce the graphics fidelity of the game you're running. So in Pop 1's case, you have 3 different graphics options: fast, ultra, or inferno. So if you were having issues with game frame latency, you would want to start by reducing the graphics fidelity if you're not already set to fast. If that doesn't fix the issue, your only other option really would be to reduce the resolution that you're rendering the game at, or the frame rate that you're rendering the game at, to ease up some of the workload on the computer so it can get those frames out faster. The encoding latency is how long it takes to encode those frames coming from the game. So game renders frame, and then it sends it over, and that frame has to get encoded. So in this instance, that encoding process is taking 6 milliseconds. If your encoding number were to turn yellow and that encoding latency were to be too high, really the only things you can do to improve that is, again, to reduce the resolution of the game. So the less pixels the encoder has to encode, the easier time it's going to have. And again, reduce the frame rate. The less frames the encoder has to encode, the easier time it's going to have as well. Beyond that, really the only thing you can do to reduce your encoding times is to buy a more expensive, more powerful GPU. So yeah, that is how we can get our encoding times down. Now I'm going to skip over networking because we're going to get into the weeds with that one. But decoding, again, decoding is never really going to be an issue unless you set your bitrate too high, or if your resolution is really high. But both those things, decoding high resolution frames or decoding a really high bitrate stream is going to cause your decoder to latency to increase and become out of spec. So if you're having issues with decoding, either reduce bitrate or reduce frame resolution, or also frame rate. Resolution and frame rate really is across the board going to reduce latencies because it's just going to require less computing power. Okay, and then for network, yeah, so for network, let's start with just going over a basic network topology, so all of you understand kind of how a basic home network works, so you can understand how data moves through the network. In a basic home network, you obviously have the internet coming in from whatever your internet service provider comes or is, and that is going to connect to your router. Now, the router is just a computer that routes traffic around the network. So the router is what's going to figure out, like, hey, I have data coming from the internet that needs to go to this computer, so we're going to send it to this computer. Or I have data from this computer that needs to go to the internet. Or in the case of AirLink or virtual desktop, the router is going to be what figures out, hey, I have this computer that needs data to be sent and routed to our Quest 2. So it is important that you have a powerful router that can handle a decent amount of workload, because a high bit rate, low latency, performant AirLink is going to require a decently powerful router to move that information accordingly. Now, this diagram has our router, switch, and wireless access point all kind of labeled separately. Now, for most people, your router, switch, and wireless access point are going to be the same device. So I have an example here. So this is the router I use. This is the ASUS Zen Wi-Fi XT8. I will show you the Amazon listing for it, but this is a router, wireless access point, and switch all in one. So it's got the computer in it that routes all the traffic for the network. It's got the switch on the back here. Those are your ports. So that switch is it's just basically a splitter for your wireless or for wired network connection. So you have your Ethernet cables plug into here, and they all get connected to your network. And then it's got the wireless access point hardware for the Wi-Fi, for the wireless connection. Really, the only time you're going to see those three devices split apart is in like a business situation where, you know, at a business in an enterprise environment, a large, business network, you will have a dedicated router. You're going to have many switches. You're going to have many wireless access points. But for a home network, most people just have an all-in-one device that encompasses all these functions simultaneously. So that hopefully kind of covers the topology and how data kind of moves around your network and how it all works. So now we'll kind of show you. So this is what I was just showing you here. This is the ASUS Zen Wi-Fi XT8. Now this is really marketed as a mesh Wi-Fi access point. Now you can buy it in a one-pack variation. So that is that you just get a single router and single wireless access point. And that is the way I have it currently set up. Now the reason it's marketed as a mesh system is because it is tri-band. And that third band is typically used as a dedicated Wi-Fi radio to connect the different wireless access points together. So this dedicated backhaul that they're talking about here is the third band. So most people have a dual band wireless access point or a dual band router. That is, it has a 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi radio band and it has a 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi radio band. This router has a 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi radio band and two 5 gigahertz bands for 3 bands in total. Now, if you are a MetaQuest Pro user, I'm actually going to recommend you pick up. Oh, by the way, this if you end up going with this model, Well, for one, there is actually a newer version, so you might and want to pick up that. It's basically the same thing, but a little newer. It's a little faster, got some newer features. Um, that would be the Asus Zen Wi-Fi XT9. And then you can also pick up a little wall mount, which is kind of nice. So you can position it ideally in your VR room, which we will be talking about later. Positioning your Wi-Fi access point in a good spot so that your headset can connect to it clearly. Now, if you have a Meta Quest Pro, um, the Meta Quest Pro actually comes with Wi-Fi 6E compatibility. Now, 6E is a newer Wi-Fi standard. It is a 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi radio. So I'm actually going to recommend that if you have a Meta Quest Pro, that you go ahead and pick up a Wi-Fi 6E tri-band router. I do not recommend going with any of the like smart home focused Amazon Arrows or the Google also has a Google Nest Wi-Fi Pro. I don't recommend going with those because those routers are typically not very configurable. They try to do all the configuration for you, and for a performant AirLink or wireless VR experience, we want to be able to configure our Wi-Fi network how we want it. I'm also not going to recommend picking up any TP-Link routers, as the folks over at Virtual Desktop have actually said that TP-Link has some issues with their implementation of one of the Wi-Fi features that causes issues with Virtual Desktop specifically. I don't think it would cause issues with AirLink because of the different network protocols that those use, but for Virtual Desktop, TP-Link routers are a known issue. So I do recommend picking up, if you have, again, a Meta Quest Pro only, or if you're watching this video in the future and you've picked up a Quest 3 once that comes out, which should also support Wi-Fi 6E, that you go ahead and you pick up a tri-band Wi-Fi 6E router. Something like this Asus. I have an Asus router, so this guide is going to show you how to configure Asus router specifically, but something like this, these Netgears would also work. Something that's going to be that's Wi-Fi 6E compatible, but also configurable. We want to be able to configure the Wi-Fi radios to work how we want them to work, how Amazon wants them to work. Okay. Oh yeah, and what I was saying about that backhaul. Yeah, so typically, like with these new Wi-Fi 6E devices, they're typically marketed as this like 6 gigahertz being a really strong, fast, low latency, wireless dedicated connection between the various routers in your home. If you have a big home and you need multiple Wi-Fi access points to cover the whole place with Wi-Fi. But in our case, we are going to use that third Wi-Fi band as a dedicated connection to our Quest 2. It's very important. So that will allow us to keep our 5 gigahertz band and our 2.4 gigahertz band for our general Wi-Fi network. So we're not running into that issue like Pink was mentioning earlier with his network, where he has a dual band router where he dedicated the 5 gigahertz band to his Quest 2 and is running everything off the slow 2.4 gigahertz band and is experiencing slow network issues as a result. I think he said specifically his TV was buffering because he dedicated his 5 gigahertz to his Quest, and everything else is on the 2.4 gigahertz. So by investing in a tri-band router, we can dedicate that fastest band to our Quest 2, but we can still keep the 5 gigahertz band and the 2.4 gigahertz band for the rest of our network, so that everything else in the house still works as it should and isn't experiencing really bad Wi-Fi performance. Okay, so that hopefully goes over the hardware part of it. Now we're going to switch over to Wi-Fi. And quickly, I just want to go over some basic Wi-Fi concepts here. So, so the 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi channel is split, or Wi-Fi radio is split up into various channels. There's something like 20 or 30 channels available to the entire 5 gigahertz frequency, though not all wireless access points are able to use all of these channels. Only the fancy, more expensive ones, like I'm showing you in this video. If you have a basic router, you probably can't use it. It probably can't broadcast to each of these channels. It's probably limited to a few of these channels. But a channel is basically, the best way to think of it is like a lane on the road. So a single channel is like a single lane. And Wi-Fi radios broadcast at a specific channel bandwidth. So you could set your 5 gigahertz radio to broadcast at a 20 megahertz bandwidth. That would be like setting it to broadcast to a single road or a single lane. A 40 megahertz bandwidth consumes 2 channels and is like 2 lanes of road. An 80 megahertz bandwidth consumes 4 channels or is like a 4-lane road. And obviously a 160 megahertz channel bandwidth consumes 8 channels and is like an 8-lane highway. So the 20 megahertz channel is going to be slower. You have less overall bandwidth if you're only broadcasting at 20 megahertz. The Quest 2 is limited to an 80 megahertz connection. So later, I'm going to show you how we're going to configure our Wi-Fi access point to broadcast its 5 gigahertz, a dedicated Wi-Fi radio for the Quest 2 at 80 megahertz so that you're utilizing all the bandwidth possible for your Quest 2. Now, before we do that, let me first go back and talk about how we can optimize the connection going to the router. So we want to make sure that, so again, our we have frames coming from the computer to the Quest, and to do that, they have to go through your router. So first, the data has to move from your computer to the router. And to do that, we want to connect it to the router with a cable or an Ethernet cable. That's going to give us the fastest, most reliable connection to the router itself. You do not want to be connected to the router from your PC over Wi-Fi. You're not going to have a good AirLink or virtual desktop experience if your PC is connected to the router over Wi-Fi. Now, we're also going to want to make sure that our router is positioned close to our Quest 2 so that there's as little interference as possible and that the signal strength remains strong between the wireless access point and the Quest 2. So ideally, your gaming PC, your router, and your Quest 2 are all going to be in the same room with your gaming PC connected directly to the router with a cable and the router positioned close to where you're using the Quest 2 in the room. For some of you out there, that may not be possible. And I'm not going to go over the different ways that you can work around this in this video, but there are ways you can go about creating a reliable Wi-Fi or AirLink and virtual desktop experience when you are not able to wire your computer directly to the router or or have the router positioned in the same room as your Quest 2. Now, for a lot of you, it might just be better to, again, use that VR AirBridge. That's probably going to be the simplest if you can't put your PC router and if you can't have your PC router and Quest 2 all in the same room. For those of you who want something better than the AirBridge, but also can't do that, really the issue is just going to be money. But if you are in that situation and you do have the money to invest, I can explain, or if you contact me on Discord, I can help you with some various solutions as to how you could get a fast, reliable connection between your PC and router and back to your Quest 2 without them all being in the same room. Now, moving on. So once you have your PC connected to your router and your router close to your Quest 2, the only variable left to optimize as far as the data moving as quickly as possible from your PC to your Quest. So it's moving from the Quest to the router. You've got a powerful router that's getting that data moved along through the wireless access point and sending it over the Quest 2. So now we need to actually optimize the wireless access point itself, or our Wi-Fi. And the way we can do that is by going into the router's web GUI or admin portal. So for those of you that don't know, if you put in the IP address of your router into a web browser, you will actually be presented with the router's sort of control panel. So you can find your router's IP by opening up a command prompt and typing in ipconfig. That's going to spit out all these various numbers here, but the important one is the default gateway. That is the IP address of your router. So if we copy this IP address here, this is the IP address of my router in my home, and we open a browser tab and paste it in, we're going to be presented with a login for the router's control panel. I'm going to go ahead and sign in here. And so we'll be presented with this dashboard, and here you're going to see, here are our 3 Wi-Fi radio bands that I was talking about. We have the 2.4 gigahertz, we have the 5 gigahertz, and we have the second 5 gigahertz. So the 2.4 gigahertz and the first 5 gigahertz radios are addressed to SlickFi. That is the name of the network. So when we go to our Wi-Fi networks to connect to the networks around us, you are going to see SlickFi, and that encompasses both 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz. This is my general Wi-Fi network. This is what I connect all the various devices in my house to connect them to the internet. And I'm still able to maintain a 5 gigahertz connection because I have that tri-band router. So all these devices are still going to have a fast, reliable, consistent connection to the internet. And then the second 5 gigahertz connection is assigned to a different network called VR5. And this is the network that only my Quest 2 is going to be connected to. No other devices are going to be connected to this network. And what that does is that ensures that there's going to be no interference, no disruption between the Wi-Fi radio and the headset. No other device on this Wi-Fi network is going to be trying to access any data or trying to pull the Wi-Fi radio's attention from the Quest 2. That is going to make sure that our Wi-Fi radio can focus solely on the Quest 2 and never be interrupted. So once we've done that, once we've dedicated one of our 5 gigahertz bands to the Quest 2 itself and connected only the Quest 2 to that band, we can go about and we can do some further optimizations on the Wi-Fi radio itself. So first things first, I'm just going to show you the second 5 gigahertz band here because that's the one that's connecting directly to our Quest and only our Quest. So I've got it here set in wireless mode AX only. AX only is Wi-Fi 6. That's 802.11ax, or more consumer-friendly name is Wi-Fi 6. The Quest 2 supports Wi-Fi 6. So I have this radio set to Wi-Fi 6 only, so that there's never any confusion, and that's the signal between the connection between my Quest 2 and the router. It never gets downgraded to Wi-Fi 5 or anything like that. Obviously, we want Wi-Fi 6 enabled. Wi-Fi agile multiband, we're not concerned with and will not improve our AirLink connection, so we got it disabled. Target wake time does not improve our AirLink connection, so it's disabled. Channel bandwidth, so that's what I was talking about earlier. So as I mentioned earlier, Quest 2 only supports up to an 80 megahertz channel bandwidth, so that's what we have this set to. Our radio on the Zen Wi-Fi XT8 is capable of a 160 megahertz bandwidth, but I have that disabled because it is useless for the Quest 2. The Quest 2 cannot connect via an 160 megahertz connection. Okay, so the next really important one is our control channel. This is the actual Wi-Fi channel that our 5 gigahertz radio is broadcasting on. And we want to make sure that this is an open and uninterfered channel. So we can do that with some special software. If you have a Windows PC with Wi-Fi capabilities, you can install this software called InSSID. It is free. You do have to make an account, but it is free software. You can also get similar software. There's other software that is the same thing available for Windows. There's software available for Mac. And you can even find some apps in the Android Play Store. So if you have an Android device, there are some free apps in the Play Store you can download that do the same thing that this software does. And that is it scans all the Wi-Fi networks around us and shows us all the Wi-Fi networks around us, their various signal strengths, and the channels they're utilizing. So if we go into this software under channels, we see here all the various Wi-Fi channels and their channel utilization, Wi-Fi utilization. So all these channels that show high Wi-Fi utilization are channels we want to avoid. We do not want to put our Wi-Fi network on or near these channels with high utilization. So for in the instance of SlickFi, we look here, if I click on SlickFi, you see SlickFi is highlighted in blue, and all the other channels are these gray bars down here. So you see on the 2.4 gigahertz network, my network is positioned. So it is overlapping and there is some interference from other networks, but it's positioned on a channel where it's overlapping with the least and experience the least interference from other networks. My 5 gigahertz band is actually, so for my 5 gigahertz band for SlickFi is also operating on some channels that are that no other Wi-Fi access points are broadcasting on, so it is completely uninterfered. So I could actually, like, I have a very good Wi-Fi experience through SlickFi because my 5 gigahertz band is also not experiencing any other Wi-Fi interference from the other Wi-Fi networks around it. Typically, you won't see this. I'm very lucky. Most Wi-Fi 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi bands are going to broadcast on these lower channels or the higher channels. Most consumer Wi-Fi access points either broadcast on these lower 40 number 40 channels or the higher like 157 channel up here is where most consumer Wi-Fi routers are going to broadcast their 5 gigahertz radios to. Now, my router, it's if we pop back into or before we do that, let me just show you here my VRFi. So if we look at VRFi, it's very low Wi-Fi utilization, and all the adjacent channels around it are also very low utilization. There's almost no utilization on the channels that which VRFi is using, or any of the adjacent channels, and that is very important. You especially want to make sure that there's very little channel utilization on the one you're using, but having little utilization on the adjacent channels is also useful to avoiding any Wi-Fi interference. So now let's pop back into my router's admin portal here, and I'll quickly show you. So my first 5 gigahertz band doesn't actually even allow me to change the channels that I'm broadcasting on. It only provides 4 options here. And again, I'm broadcasting at an 80 megahertz channel bandwidth. So my bandwidth is using 4 channels worth of width. So it doesn't matter which channel I select here. I'm limited to basically the same 4 channels no matter what. So with this router, the first 5 gigahertz band actually can't change, swap to a different channel at all, which isn't really an issue. Now for our VR Wi-Fi radio, I have selected channel 120, and that's because in my software that I was showing you there, I could see that channel has the least Wi-Fi utilization, or some of the least Wi-Fi utilization I could possibly assign it to. You could set this to auto. Auto will try to broadcast to, it'll try to switch channels around to broadcast to the ones that are currently least utilized. But the problem is it is changing channels, and you could be in the middle of a VR, of playing VR, and it swaps channels on you. And when it swaps channels, you're going to experience a dropout in connection, a temporary drop in connection, and that's going to be very frustrating. So I do recommend making sure that your control channel is set to a specific channel, not auto, so that you're never seeing your channels change, and that the channel you select is one which has very little utilization and very little interference. That's a very, very important step. Beyond that, there are some other Wi-Fi features here that we can optimize to make sure we're getting the best single user Wi-Fi experience. I say single user because we have a single client connected to this Wi-Fi radio, and some of these features are specifically designed to optimize traffic to multiple users or multiple clients connected to the radio. So we want to make sure that we're optimizing for a single client, for a single device connected to this Wi-Fi radio. So a lot of these first settings are fairly obvious. First one that really matters here is our multicast rate. And this is very important for AirLink specifically because AirLink actually broadcasts on a multicast signal. So our multicast rate is going to govern basically how fast that multicast rate is, or how fast that multicast is being broadcast. So I don't really know what the OSDM 54 means, but what I do mean is highest number equals fastest. So setting our multicast rate to the highest number here is going to ensure that we're getting the fastest multicast experience from our Wi-Fi access point to our Quest 2 when using AirLink. Now, I did ask the virtual desktop developer, G. Godin, if virtual desktop also uses a multicast signal to broadcast virtual desktop, and he says no, it uses unicast over TCP. So this Wi-Fi optimization will not affect virtual desktop. This is another reason AirLink will actually result in lower latency because it's using multicast instead of unicast, and multicast with this optimization will result in lower latencies than a unicast broadcast over TCP like virtual desktop. AMPDU RTS, this is a feature that is related to having multiple clients or lots of traffic in the area. And as I was explaining, we're optimizing to reduce our wireless traffic or our wireless interference as much as possible. And we do have no other devices connected to this Wi-Fi radio. So any feature related to lots of devices and lots of Wi-Fi traffic can be disabled. Beacon interval and DTIM interval. The beacon interval is basically how often the Wi-Fi radio is broadcasting its network name and the fact that the network exists to all the devices around it. So when you get on your phone or you get on your computer and you go click on the Wi-Fi icon or go to connect to a Wi-Fi network, you notice all the Wi-Fi networks start populating in the list of Wi-Fi networks around you. That is the beacon. That is your phone or your computer picking up on those beacons and displaying them in that menu. So this is a time in milliseconds. So right now, by default, beacon would be configured to 100 milliseconds. That's the default for almost all wireless access points. I have reduced that beacon interval to 250 milliseconds. So I've reduced that beacon from firing off 10 times a second to 4 times a second. And that is just going to reduce the amount of time that the beacon is taking away from our more useful data, our multicast data that is headed to our headset. DTIM interval is along the same, it's kind of similar to beacon. DTIM interval fires off 4 would be how many beacons between when a DTIM is sent off. So 4 beacons would be a whole second. So I have it configured to send off a DTIM every second. And DTIM is just related to multicast data. So I haven't had any issues with this setup. So again, since we're only broadcasting to a single device, the Quest 2, we really don't need our beacon firing off very often. We don't need this information firing off very often because there's not a lot of devices to communicate with and give this information to. So that is why I've reduced those intervals to fire off less. Enable TX bursting is not useful for multicast data. Because we're just keeping a consistent, strong, fast connection to our Quest 2, we don't need to be bursting our transfer rate. It's not going to be useful. Enable Wi-Fi multimedia. I don't think this has any effect on multicast data. This might have an effect on the unicast data coming from virtual desktop. I'm not sure, but in general, it's safe to keep enabled. It comes enabled by default. This WMM no acknowledgement comes by default disabled. I've enabled it because it says when enabled, it results in more efficient throughput. It also says but higher error rates in a noisy radio frequency. But we just talked about how we are going to reduce the noise and set our Wi-Fi channel and and configure our Wi-Fi for the least noise possible. So ideally, you'll be able to set your Wi-Fi channel to a channel that has no noise, and so we can enable this WMM no acknowledgement and benefit from the higher throughput, more efficient throughput. Optimize AMPDU aggregation. I have this enabled because I was reading a study or a research paper done on the exact topic we're talking about. Was done many years back trying to optimize Wi-Fi for VR and AR experiences. And they found that enabling AMPDU aggregation did result in lower latencies for multicast data for VR and AR applications. So that's why I've enabled it. Airtime fairness is a kind of an older Wi-Fi feature that should always be disabled. As far as I can tell, it pretty much always makes things worse on any Wi-Fi network. Again, it's an older feature, and modern Wi-Fi devices really will just suffer from airtime fairness more than anything. Multi-user MIMO, I have that disabled because, again, it has multi-user in the name. It has to do with efficiently delivering data to multiple devices. We are only connected to a single device, so it does not affect us, and we can just turn it off so it's not adding any complexity to the Wi-Fi access point. OFDMA is also a technology that has to do with efficiently delivering data to multiple devices. We are only connected to a single device, so I have that disabled as well. AXAC beamforming and universal beamforming we have enabled. That just tries to basically direct the Wi-Fi signal towards your device that's connected to it. So in this case, the Quest 2. So obviously that can be useful for improving the connection between a Quest 2, though ideally, again, your access point's in the same room as your Quest 2, so it doesn't really matter that much because it's going to have a strong signal regardless. And the last option here, TX power adjustment. This is how much power is going to the Wi-Fi radios themselves. So really, you always want to set this to the highest level. ASUS denotes this as the performance setting, but really it's just the highest power setting. Now, there is a situation where you might want to decrease this, and that is if you were in a small room with your wireless access point very, very close to your Quest 2. Let's say you're in a smaller room and you have your wireless access point mounted to the ceiling or to a wall really close to you. Really close to you. You might want to reduce your power setting on the Wi-Fi radio, because if you're too close to your Wi-Fi access point, you actually can create noise and interference, because it's like staring into a bright light. It's like your Quest 2 is staring into a bright light. You know, when you turn a light on in a room, that light helps you see. But if you turn a bright light on and you stand really close to it and stare directly into it, that light is going to blind you. And it's the same thing for your Quest 2. If the wireless access point's too close to your Quest 2 and the power setting is too high and that Wi-Fi signal coming off the AP is too strong, you could actually end up blinding your Quest 2. Now, I have mine set to the performance setting, and I stand about 10 to 15 feet away from my wireless access point, and I have no issues whatsoever. So I haven't had any issues. I haven't needed to reduce the power, but that is what it's there for if you need to. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. We'll go over a quick recap here. So again, AirLink's going to have lower latency. Virtual Desktop's going to have better quality. Let me pull this back over here. Again, if you want a simple AirLink setup, this is only going to work for AirLink, but if you just want something simple, $100, you can get this D-Link via AirBridge. It works fairly well to get AirLink up and going. Again, we want to make sure that our PC is wired to our router and our router is close to our Quest 2 when we're doing AirLink or Virtual Desktop. We want to make sure that we have a powerful router with 3 Wi-Fi bands, ideally 2 5 gigahertz bands, or if you have a Meta Quest Pro or a Quest 3, you want one that has the 5 gigahertz band and the 6 gigahertz band, so that you can dedicate the 6 gigahertz band to your MetaQuest Pro or your Quest 3. Um, and yeah, make sure that you're setting your dedicated AirLink or virtual desktop Wi-Fi radio to a Wi-Fi channel that is low interference, low utilization, so that you're getting as little interference as possible to prevent any sort of interference or Wi-Fi errors and cause packets to need to be resent. Yeah, and once you've done all that, assuming you don't have any environmental issues, or you're able to put your PC and your router and your Quest 2 all in the same room and whatnot, you should have a flawless AirLink virtual desktop experience. I personally run my AirLink at 120 frames per second and have no frame drops ever. It is perfectly smooth 120% of the time. It took me a lot of time to figure all this out and and optimize everything and configure everything. I mean, it was not easy getting my internet wired into this room and getting everything positioned properly in this house and getting my internet working. For those of you that know me, I have lots of issues with the internet itself, and whatnot. But we've worked through it all, and I've got everything configured and figured out all the little nitty gritties to get AirLink and virtual desktop wireless VR working as well as possible. So yeah, if you follow all these steps and configure everything this way, you should be able to get a stable 120 frames per second, low latency wireless VR connection to your Quest 2 or other Wi-Fi based VR device. These tips can also work for your Pico Neo 4 or any Oculus device going into the future. So yeah, that is it. I hope that helps all the VR users out there. I hope that helps you, Pink Ponage, and yeah, that's all for today.